Big Shaq thought exposing Captain Bennett would end the corruption, but he was wrong. Bennett wasn't working alone. Just when he thinks it's over, a mysterious call changes everything. You should have left it alone. Someone more powerful is still out there, pulling the strings. And now, they're watching him. The truth is bigger than he imagined, and the real fight is just beginning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city of Ridgewater had always carried a reputation, one built on power, money, and secrets buried so deep that no one dared to dig them up. But Big Shaq wasn't just anyone. He had spent years navigating the world of fame, business, and influence, but nothing prepared him for the darkness that lurked inside the Ridgewater Police Department. It all started with a simple conversation, a whispered warning from an old friend at a charity gala. Don't trust them, Shaq. The department isn't what it seems. If you go looking, you might not like what you find. Shaq wasn't the kind of man to ignore warnings, but he also wasn't the kind to walk away from the truth. So he started looking, and what he found was worse than he ever imagined. Captain Royce Bennett wasn't just a police officer. He was the system itself. Powerful, untouchable, and feared by those who worked under him. He had built an empire within the department, controlling not just the officers, but the very fabric of Ridgewater's justice system. Under his leadership, crimes disappeared, evidence was tampered with, and anyone who questioned him simply ceased to exist. For years, honest cops had tried to take him down, but every attempt ended in failure. Cases fell apart, witnesses vanished, and the most recent officer who had tried, Detective Carter Vance, had disappeared without a trace. At first, it had been reported as a leave of absence. Then, whispers started. Vance had been onto something big, something that could bring the whole department crashing down. But before he could go public, he was gone. No one questioned it. No one even mentioned his name. Except Shaq. Shaq had friends in high places, people who owed him favors, people who had access to files that weren't meant to be seen. And when he started asking questions, he found exactly what Bennett had been trying to hide. Ridgewater's crime rate wasn't dropping because the police were good at their jobs. It was dropping because the crimes were being erased. Drug busts that never made it to the courtroom. Arrests that disappeared from the system. Businessmen, politicians, and criminals all tied back to one man, Captain Bennett. The more Shaq uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just corruption. This was organized crime, happening from inside the very system meant to protect people. Shaq wasn't a cop. He had no badge, no legal authority, and no reason to interfere. But that had never stopped him before. If the law couldn't hold Bennett accountable, then Shaq would find another way. That's when the idea struck him. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was the only way to get inside, to see the truth for himself. He would go undercover, not as a businessman, not as Big Shaq, but as an officer, a fake identity, a rookie badge, a chance to walk into the lion's den without them ever knowing. It was insane. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. And once he stepped inside Ridgewater PD, there would be no turning back. The Ridgewater Police Department was more than just a precinct. It was a fortress, an institution built on power, intimidation, and secrets that had been buried so deep no one dared to dig them up. But Big Shaq wasn't just anyone. For the past few weeks, he had carefully crafted a new identity. Officer Daniel Cross, a fresh-faced rookie transferring in from another city. The credentials were solid, the backstory flawless, and the connections he had used to get himself inside, even better. Still, no amount of preparation could have truly prepared him for what waited beyond those steel-reinforced doors. The moment he stepped inside, uniform crisp, badge clipped to his belt, he felt it. The tension, the unspoken rules, the way officers moved carefully around each other, avoiding certain conversations, certain people. This wasn't just a police force. This was a kingdom. And Captain Royce Bennett was its king. The front desk sergeant barely glanced at him as Shaq approached, sliding over a file with his official transfer papers. The room smelled of coffee gone stale, cheap cologne, and the distinct scent of sweat and stress, a department constantly operating on the edge. The sergeant, A thick-built man with tired eyes flipped through the file lazily before setting it down with a thud. Cross, huh? You're late. Shaq forced an easy grin. Traffic. The sergeant snorted. Welcome to Ridgewater, rookie. You'll wish traffic was the worst of your problems soon enough. Shaq didn't need to ask what that meant. He could already tell. The corruption here wasn't just a whisper. It was in the air, woven into the foundation of the department itself. After a short wait, Shaq was led into the squad room, a space that was somehow both chaotic and oppressively controlled. Desks cluttered with paperwork, officers leaning against walls, a low hum of voices exchanging stories, some of them about cases, others about things that should never be discussed in a police station. Then the room went quiet. Shaq followed their stares to the man standing in the doorway. Captain Royce Bennett. He was exactly as Shaq had expected, tall, commanding, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform that made him look more like a CEO than a cop. His presence alone made people straighten up, made conversations shift, made even the boldest officers choose their words carefully. Bennett's sharp blue eyes locked onto Shaq's, scanning him in a way that felt less like a greeting and more like an assessment. So you're the transfer, Bennett finally said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that told Shaq this was a man who spoke in orders, not conversations. Shaq nodded. Officer Daniel Cross, sir. Bennett didn't return the handshake Shaq offered. Instead, he smirked slightly and gestured toward the squad. Welcome to Ridgewater. Try to keep up. Just like that, the moment passed, but the message was clear. Bennett was watching him, and Shaq had just walked into a game where one wrong move could cost him everything. Shaq took his assigned desk, blending in as best he could, keeping his ears open. He needed time to assess, to figure out how the system worked from the inside. But before he could get too comfortable, a voice cut through the noise. You're either stupid or brave, walking in here like you own the place. Shaq turned and found himself looking at a woman who clearly had no patience for nonsense. Detective Lila Carter. She had the same sharp eyes as her brother, the same way of looking at people like she was already dissecting every move they made. And Shaq knew, if anyone was going to see through his act, it was her. I don't own anything, Shaq replied carefully. Just trying to do my job. Lila smirked, but it wasn't friendly. Yeah? Good luck with that. She turned to leave, but Shaq wasn't about to let her go that easily. You knew Carter Vance, didn't you? He said, testing the waters. Lila froze. When she turned back, the casual smirk was gone, replaced with something far colder. Who told you that? Shaq shrugged. He was one of the best detectives here, wasn't he? Would be hard not to know his name. For a moment, Lila just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, quietly, she said, Around here it's easier to survive if you forget certain names. And with that, she walked away. Shaq watched her go, his mind racing. She was hiding something. And if he wanted to take down Bennett, he needed her on his side. By the end of his first day, Shaq had learned 3 things. 1. Everyone feared Bennett, even those who pretended not to. His power wasn't just in his rank, it was in the way the entire system revolved around him. He was the law, even when he broke it. 2. No one mentioned Carter Vance. It was like he had never existed. No photos, no files, nothing. But Shaq knew better. The harder people tried to erase someone, the more important they had been. 3. Secrets were currency. If you wanted to survive in this department, you had to either hold a secret or be one. And right now, Shaq was both. It wasn't until late that night, after most of the officers had cleared out, that Shaq made his first real mistake. He had managed to gain access to a restricted file, one of Bennett's cases that had conveniently gone missing from public records. He was careful, moving fast, scanning for anything that might connect back to Carter Vance. Then, a voice behind him. You work fast for a rookie. Shaq turned, already knowing who it was before he saw her. Lila Carter. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were locked onto the file in his hands. For the first time since stepping into Ridgewater PD, Shaq felt the game shift. She knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not yet. But she knew enough. And now, whether he liked it or not, she was either going to be his greatest ally or his biggest threat. One thing was for sure. The real game had just begun. Shaq had been in the Ridgewater Police Department for just over 2 weeks, and already the cracks in the system were wider than he'd imagined. At first, it was the little things, the way officers avoided eye contact when certain names were mentioned, the missing case files that should have been locked away but instead were nowhere to be found. Then, the bigger things, the way arrests were strategically placed in media headlines, how criminals walked free without a single charge, and worst of all, the way innocent people were framed for crimes they never committed. This wasn't just corruption. This was control. Captain Royce Bennett wasn't just running a dirty department. He was running the entire city's justice system like his personal empire. And Shaq was getting too close to the truth. Shaq's first real lead came when he was assigned to review arrest reports, a rookie's task, one designed to keep him occupied while the real officers handled actual cases. But he wasn't looking for what was there. He was looking for what was missing. And then, he found it. Case number B1729, Landon Pierce. According to the report, Landon had been arrested for armed robbery, caught on camera outside a convenience store. The file was airtight. Photos, witness statements, surveillance footage, everything. Too perfect. Shaq knew setups when he saw them. The timestamps on the security footage were off by 5 minutes. The statements from the witnesses were word for word identical, as if someone had written a script and told them to memorize it. And worst of all, Landon had an alibi. A solid one. He had been at a diner across town, and the security footage there proved it. But that footage? It had been conveniently erased from the system. This wasn't just a mistake. This was intentional. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. If they were willing to fabricate an entire case against one man, how many others had they done this to? And more importantly, why? He needed proof. Real proof. And that meant going deeper than ever before. Shaq had never relied on trust, and he wasn't about to start now. If he was going to take down Captain Bennett, he needed evidence. Solid, undeniable proof that would expose everything. So he started recording. Every whispered conversation in the break room. Every shady deal made behind closed doors. Every call Bennett took where his tone dropped to something colder, more calculating. Shaq listened, memorized, pieced together the puzzle. And then, one night, he hit gold. He had been stationed for late-night desk duty, a pointless job meant to keep him out of the way. But as he sat at his desk, pretending to review files, he saw Captain Bennett slip into his office. Alone. Then, the door didn't close all the way. Shaq's heartbeat quickened. Staying low, he slid his phone from his pocket, started a recording, and carefully inched closer. Bennett's voice was low but sharp, the tone of a man who expected to be obeyed. "I don't care how you do it. Make sure the shipment gets through. If anyone asks, we never had this conversation." Shaq frowned. Shipment? Then, another voice, a man Shaq couldn't see. Deeper, rougher. "And the kid?" A long pause. Then Bennett's voice came through, colder than before. "We'll deal with him soon enough." Shaq's breath stilled. The kid. They were talking about him. By the next morning, Shaq knew something had changed. The air in the precinct was different. Sharper, heavier. Officers who had previously ignored him were watching him now. Conversations that had once been open were now cut off when he entered a room. And Captain Bennett? He was watching. Shaq could feel it. A shift in the way Bennett spoke to him, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. And then came the first real test. Bennett called him into his office, shutting the door behind him with a slow, deliberate motion. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You settling in, Officer Cross?" Bennett asked, voice smooth. Shaq kept his stance relaxed, forcing a casual nod. "Yes, sir." Bennett studied him. "Good, because I believe in keeping my department tight-knit." Shaq met his gaze evenly. "I respect that." Bennett smirked. "Do you?" Shaq didn't answer. Then Bennett leaned in slightly. "You see, in this department, we don't just work cases. We work loyalty. And when someone doesn't belong, it's noticeable." The message was clear. This was a warning. Shaq forced a polite smile. I understand, Captain. Bennett held his gaze a moment longer. Then, finally, he leaned back, nodding. Good. Let's keep it that way. Shaq walked out of the office, every instinct screaming at him. Bennett knew something, and if Shaq wasn't careful, he wouldn't just fail, he'd disappear. That night, Shaq met with Detective Lila Carter, the only person who seemed as suspicious of Bennett as he was. He played her the recording. Lila listened, her face unreadable. When it ended, she exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face. This is bad. Shaq nodded. Yeah. Lila hesitated. Then, quietly, you're not the only one investigating Bennett. Shaq frowned. What do you mean? Lila leaned forward. There's someone inside this department. Someone who's been feeding information to both sides. Shaq's blood ran cold. You're saying, yes. Lila's voice was dead serious. There's a leak, and whoever they are, they know about you. Shaq's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Someone inside Ridgewater PD knew he was undercover. And now, it was only a matter of time before Bennett did too. Shaq had come here for answers. Now, he had something even bigger. Evidence. A connection. A traitor inside the department. But if he wanted to take Bennett down, he had to move fast. Because the way things were going, if he didn't expose the truth first, Bennett would bury it. And this time, Shaq would be the one who disappeared. The Ridgewater Police Department had always felt like a game of chess. Powerful pieces moving in the shadows, controlling everything, while pawns were sacrificed without a second thought. But Shaq wasn't just another pawn. He had come here with a purpose, a mission to expose Captain Royce Bennett and everything he was hiding. But tonight, the game was changing, and Shaq was about to learn just how far Bennett was willing to go to protect his empire. Shaq sat at his desk, pretending to review a report, when an officer dropped a folder in front of him. You're up, rookie, the officer said, his tone laced with something Shaq couldn't quite place. Shaq picked up the file, flipping it open. Inside was a detailed breakdown of a planned sting operation. Drugs, cash, a known criminal set to make a drop. According to the report, Shaq had been personally assigned to assist with the takedown, but something felt off. For weeks, he had been kept in the background, assigned to paperwork and routine patrols. Now, suddenly, he was being thrown into a major sting. And then there was the location. Pier 17. Shaq had heard enough whispers in the department to know that Pier 17 wasn't just some random spot. It was a known drop site for Bennett's backdoor deals. This wasn't just a sting. This was a test. Shaq arrived at the pier just before midnight. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of salt water mixing with oil and rust. Officers were already in position, but the whole scene felt too controlled. The suspect, a mid-level dealer named Milo Grant, stood near a rusted shipping container, hands shoved into his hoodie pocket. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't running. Because he knew this was never a real bust. Bennett stood at the edge of the dock, arms crossed, watching everything unfold with a smirk. He hadn't even bothered to hide. Shaq kept his face unreadable as he approached. We good to move in? Shaq asked, keeping his tone casual. Bennett barely looked at him. Not yet. We need proof. Then he turned to Shaq fully, smirking slightly. Since you're new, why don't you handle the search? Shaq's stomach tightened. This was the test. If he followed through, if he planted evidence or went along with whatever false charge Bennett had cooked up, he'd pass. He'd be one of them. But if he hesitated, if he refused, his cover would be blown. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He stepped forward, searching Milo while keeping his mind racing for an out. He needed to buy time, to figure out his next move without exposing himself. But then, Milo spoke. You should have walked away, man, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Shaq to hear. Shaq froze for a fraction of a second. Milo knew this was a setup, knew Shaq wasn't really one of them. Shaq barely had time to process before Bennett stepped closer, voice low and laced with amusement. Something wrong, Officer Cross? Shaq forced himself to move. He couldn't hesitate. He patted down Milo's pockets, making sure not to plant anything before stepping back. He's clean. Silence. The air around them grew heavier. Then Bennett laughed, a slow, knowing chuckle. Well, what do you know? Looks like our intel was bad. Milo exhaled quietly, and Shaq knew. He had just dodged a bullet. But Bennett wasn't done with him yet. You're done for the night, rookie. Head back. Shaq nodded, keeping his expression neutral as he turned and walked away. But he could feel Bennett's eyes on his back the whole time, and something told him this wasn't over. Shaq drove aimlessly for an hour after leaving the pier. He knew going back to his apartment was a mistake. Bennett was watching him now. He needed a place to think, to regroup. He called Lila Carter. They met at an old diner on the edge of town, a place with flickering neon lights and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Lila sat across from him, arms crossed. You were right, Shaq admitted. It was a test, and I barely got out of it. Lila's jaw tightened. Bennett suspects you. It's only a matter of time before he makes a move. Shaq exhaled. We need something bigger. Something that can blow this whole thing open. Lila hesitated, then slowly she pulled out a flash drive. She slid it across the table. This might be it. Shaq frowned, picking it up. Where did you get this? Lila's gaze darkened. From someone who's supposed to be dead. Shaq stared at her. What are you talking about? Lila swallowed hard. My brother. Carter. Shaq's breath caught. Carter Vance, the detective who had gone missing after trying to expose Bennett. The man everyone assumed was dead. He's alive, Lila said, and he's been held hostage for the past 6 months. The diner suddenly felt too small. Shaq gripped the flash drive tighter. Where is he? Lila's voice was barely a whisper. An abandoned facility on the east side. Shaq leaned forward. Then we need to get to him, before Bennett does. They arrived at the facility just after 2 a.m. It was an old factory, the kind of place people forgot about, except for the ones using it for things they didn't want found. The air was thick with tension as they stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then, a sound. A faint tapping coming from a locked door in the back. Shaq moved quickly, picking the lock with skills he wasn't supposed to have. The door swung open, and there, sitting on the ground, weak but alive, was Detective Carter Vance. Lila rushed to him, her voice breaking. Carter, oh my God. Carter looked up, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also recognition. You shouldn't have come here, he rasped. Shaq knelt beside him. We're getting you out. Now. But before Carter could respond, his expression shifted, fear flooding into his features. Shaq turned just in time to hear it. The sound of approaching footsteps. They had been followed. Shaq's heart pounded as shadows moved at the entrance. Lila helped Carter up, whispering, We need to go. Shaq glanced at the flash drive still in his pocket. The proof was there. The truth was finally within reach. But first, they had to survive the night. Outside, a car engine rumbled. Shaq exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about exposing Bennett anymore. This was about making it out alive. And with every passing second, that was becoming less likely. The truth was a powerful thing. It could bring down kings, unravel empires, and turn heroes into villains with a single headline. But only if the right people controlled the story. And right now, Captain Royce Bennett controlled everything. Shaq had gathered enough evidence to burn the entire Ridgewater Police Department to the ground. Recordings of backroom deals, proof of false arrests, a list of bribes that stretched all the way to City Hall. And the biggest revelation of all? Detective Carter Vance was alive. It should have been over. Shaq should have been celebrating, preparing to go public with proof that Bennett wasn't just corrupt. He was a criminal masquerading as a cop. But the moment Shaq and Lila stepped out of that abandoned facility with Carter Vance leaning against them for support, they realized the game had already changed. Because Bennett had moved first. And now, Shaq was the one being hunted. The first hit came the next morning. Shaq had barely slept, working through the night to organize every piece of evidence he had collected. The plan was simple. Get Carter to a safe location, leak the files to the press, and watch Bennett's empire collapse on live television. But when Shaq turned on the news, his own face stared back at him. Breaking news. Officer Daniel Cross under investigation for leaking police records. Shaq's stomach dropped. A well-dressed news anchor spoke in an even, authoritative tone. Sources inside the Ridgewater PD have confirmed that Officer Daniel Cross, a recent transfer, is now a prime suspect in an internal investigation. According to police reports, Cross has been linked to multiple data breaches and is believed to have tampered with classified case files. Officials say they are concerned about his connections to known criminals and his erratic behavior over the past few weeks. Shaq's jaw tightened. They were flipping the story. They weren't just covering up the truth. They were twisting it, painting him as the dirty cop, making sure that by the time he had a chance to speak, no one would believe a word he said. And the worst part? It was working. Shaq knew how these things worked. Bennett had contacts in the media, judges in his pocket, politicians who owed him favors. If he had the power to erase crimes, he had the power to manufacture them too. Shaq's phone buzzed. Unknown caller. He hesitated before answering. Yeah? A deep, measured voice filled the line. You had a good run, rookie. Shaq didn't need to ask who it was. Bennett. You should have kept your head down, the captain continued, his voice eerily calm. Now you've got every cop in the city looking for you. You really think some grainy recordings and a washed-up detective are enough to take me down? Shaq gritted his teeth. I think the truth is enough. Bennett chuckled. Truth doesn't matter if no one hears it. Then the line went dead. Shaq gripped the phone tightly. Bennett wasn't just trying to silence him, he was erasing him. By noon, Shaq's access to the department's internal servers was revoked. By 2 p.m., his bank account was frozen. By 4 p.m., an official arrest warrant was issued in his name. By nightfall, every officer in Ridgewater PD had received a direct order. Bring in Daniel Cross, by any means necessary. Shaq had no real badge, no real allies, no resources. But he still had one thing left: Lila Carter. They met in a parking garage where the glow of flickering lights cast long, sharp shadows against the concrete. Lila leaned against her car, arms crossed, face unreadable. They're saying you leaked classified files. Shaq let out a bitter laugh. Of course they are. Lila sighed. Every officer is looking for you. You're officially the most wanted man in Ridgewater. Shaq ran a hand over his face. Yeah? Well, I've got a missing detective, a hard drive full of evidence, and about 48 hours before Bennett wipes every trace of this off the map. Lila studied him for a long moment. Then she pulled something from her jacket and tossed it at him. Shaq caught it. A burner phone. I know someone who can get the evidence to the press, she said. But we need to be smart about this. No more reacting. We make the next move. Shaq met her gaze. What are you suggesting? She smirked. We set a trap. For Bennett thought he had won. He thought he had Shaq cornered, thought that if he controlled the media, the department, and the city, nothing could touch him. But Shaq had spent his life learning how to play the long game. And now? It was time to flip the board. Lila had a contact, an investigative journalist who didn't play by the rules, someone who had been waiting for a scandal big enough to burn Ridgewater PD to the ground. But a news leak wasn't enough. If they wanted to destroy Bennett, they needed to catch him in the act. So they planned the final move. A public meeting. A secret exchange of dirty money, recorded in real time. Shaq would bait Bennett into a deal, forcing him to expose himself. The evidence would be sent to every major news outlet in the city. Live, in real time, before Bennett had a chance to bury it. One shot. One chance to take him down. No room for mistakes. Shaq took a deep breath, looking at the city stretched before him. In 48 hours, this would all be over. One way or another. Lila checked her watch. You ready for this? Shaq clenched his fists. Yeah. Because for the first time since stepping into Ridgewater PD, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was about to end this. Shaq had one shot. One moment to bring everything crumbling down, to rip Captain Royce Bennett from his throne and expose him for what he really was. Everything had led to this. The corruption, the lies, the framing of innocent people, the near-death escape from Bennett's trap. The discovery that Detective Carter Vance was still alive, and now with 48 hours left before Bennett erased all traces of his crimes, Shaq was about to flip the script. Bennett thought he had won. That was his first mistake. Shaq and Lila knew Bennett controlled the media, but there was one loophole: a live press conference. It was scheduled for noon sharp, set in the grand hall of Ridgewater's city council building, packed with journalists, officials, and police brass. Bennett was planning to paint himself as the hero once again, claiming the department was undergoing an internal review to remove bad actors like Shaq. What he didn't know was that Shaq had rigged the event against him. Lila had leaked files to independent journalists, reporters who weren't on Bennett's payroll. Carter Vance was hidden nearby, waiting for the right moment. Shaq had set up a real-time data drop, scheduled to release live evidence the second Bennett took the stage. It wasn't just about exposing Bennett. It was about doing it in front of the entire city, where he couldn't escape. Bennett had spent years burying the truth. Now, it was about to bury him. The press conference hall was packed. Bennett stood at the podium, wearing his usual confident smirk, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, looking every bit the respected captain he had spent years pretending to be. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. Then, Bennett leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "Ridgewater PD has always been committed to justice. Unfortunately, in recent weeks, we have discovered serious breaches of trust within our ranks. Officer Daniel Cross." Then it happened. The big screen behind Bennett flickered. A new feed took over. A video. Bennett's face dropped. The room stilled. Then, his own voice boomed through the speakers. "I don't care how you do it. Make sure the shipment gets through. If anyone asks, we never had this conversation." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Another clip played. "We'll deal with him soon enough." Then came the paperwork. Transaction logs. Arrest records showing fabricated evidence. A file labeled Carter Vance. Classified. Bennett went pale. Shaq stepped forward from the crowd, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You want to talk about corruption, Captain?" Shaq said, his voice sharp. "Let's talk about how you tried to kill a man who's standing just outside this room." A collective gasp. Bennett's grip tightened on the podium. Shaq turned toward the doors. "Come on in, Carter." The doors swung open. And in walked Detective Carter Vance. Alive. The journalists exploded with questions. Cameras turned. The mayor's expression hardened. Bennett took one step back. His empire was cracking. And Shaq had just shattered it. Bennett wasn't a fool. He had one last move left. Without missing a beat, he turned toward the exit, making a direct path for the back door. His security team, confused and unsure, hesitated. That was all the time Shaq needed. "Stop him." Bennett froze. Not because of Shaq, but because of his own men. Several officers stood blocking the exit. For years they had feared him, followed his orders. But now they had seen the truth. "Captain," one of them said, his voice low. "Turn around." Bennett's jaw clenched. His grip on power was slipping, faster than he could stop it. And for the first time in his career, he had nowhere left to run. The press conference turned into a media frenzy. Bennett was taken into custody on live television. The mayor, furious, announced a full-scale investigation into Ridgewater PD. By nightfall, half the department had been placed under review. All of Bennett's financial records had been seized. Shaq's name was cleared. And most importantly, the truth had won. Shaq stood outside City Hall, watching the reporters scramble for more details, cameras flashing in every direction. Lila leaned against a railing beside him. "You did it." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "We did it." Carter Vance, still weak but very much alive, gave a knowing nod. Bennett was finished. His empire had crumbled, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. But Shaq knew the game wasn't over. This was one man, one department. And as long as corrupt people controlled the system, the fight would never truly end. Lila noticed the way Shaq was staring into the distance. "You're not done, are you?" she asked. Shaq smirked. "Not even close. Because now Now he knew just how deep the corruption ran. And this was only the beginning. The streets of Ridgewater buzzed with an energy Shaq had never felt before. It wasn't just the flashing cameras or the reporters shouting his name. It was the feeling of a city waking up. Bennett was finished. The once untouchable captain was now behind bars, his name plastered across every major news outlet. The corruption he had buried for years was finally out in the open. Investigations were underway. Officers were being suspended. And for the first time in a long time, people believed that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. Shaq had come here to uncover the truth. And he had. But standing outside City Hall, surrounded by the weight of what had just happened, he didn't feel victorious. Because the fight was far from over. The crowd outside the courthouse was growing. People held signs that read, "Justice for Ridgewater," and "Expose them all." News vans lined the street, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward, all waiting for a statement. Shaq didn't move. He didn't want the attention. He hadn't done this for the headlines or the praise. He had done it because it needed to be done. Lila nudged him. "You should say something." Shaq exhaled. "What's there to say? The system's still broken." She gave him a sideways glance. "Maybe. But for the first time, people are actually paying attention. You did that." Shaq wasn't sure how to feel about that. He had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, preferring to work in the background, pulling strings instead of being the one people looked up to. Now? The whole city was looking at him. Inside the courthouse, Detective Carter Vance sat in an empty conference room, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He was free, but he wasn't celebrating. Shaq stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You good?" Carter smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Define good." Shaq pulled up a chair, watching him. "We got him, Carter. Bennett's done." Carter studied his coffee for a moment before looking up. "You really think this is over?" Shaq didn't answer, because deep down he knew. Bennett had been powerful, yes. Corrupt, absolutely. But men like him? They didn't work alone. "I was investigating him for months before they took me," Carter said. "And everything I found pointed to something bigger. Someone bigger." Shaq frowned. "Who?" Carter shook his head. "That's the problem. I never got that far. But what I do know?" He leaned in. "Bennett wasn't at the top of the food chain." Shaq's stomach tightened. "Someone else gave him orders," Carter continued. "Someone with more power, more reach. If you think what you just pulled off was big..." He let out a slow breath. "You have no idea what you just stepped into." Shaq sat back, absorbing the weight of Carter's words. He had risked everything to expose Bennett. But now, he realized, he had only been fighting the surface of a much deeper war. It was almost midnight when Shaq finally left the courthouse. The crowd had died down, the reporters had moved on, and Ridgewater, the city that had almost swallowed him whole, felt quieter than ever. Lila walked beside him, hands in her jacket pockets. "You know, you could actually stop now." Shaq glanced at her. "And do what?" She shrugged. "Walk away. Live your life. Let the system fix itself." Shaq let out a short laugh. "You actually believe that?" Lila sighed. "Number. But I was hoping you did." They reached the parking lot, the cool night air carrying the distant hum of traffic. Shaq was about to open his car door when his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. Blocked. Shaq stared at it for a second before answering. Silence on the other end. Then a voice, calm, measured. "You should have left it alone, Shaq." The breath in his chest stilled. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice steady. The voice chuckled softly. "You really think Bennett was the problem?" A pause. "He was just the beginning." Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. "Where are you?" A long silence. Then, "Closer than you think." The line went dead. Shaq lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He turned to Lila, who was already watching him. "Something tells me you're not walking away," she said. Shaq exhaled. No. Because now he knew the truth. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. He looked out at the city. The skyline stretched before him, lights blinking like signals in the dark, There was still someone out there pulling the strings. And Shaq? He was coming for them next. The truth was just the beginning. The fight isn't over. It's only getting started. Big Shaq has exposed the first layer of corruption, but the real masterminds are still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike back. What happens next will change everything. Do you think Shaq can outsmart the ones pulling the strings? Or has he just stepped into a war he can't win? Make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Who do you think is really behind it all? Let's hear your theories. Because in this game, the truth isn't just power, it's survival.